You know, there are moments in life when you realize that everything you thought you knew about a person was just an illusion, and sometimes that realization comes not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping understanding that spreads through you like cold water seeping into the foundation of a house.
This is the story of a woman named Rachel, and it's a story about how we sometimes give everything to build a life with someone, only to discover that we were building it alone the entire time. Now, I'm sharing this story with you not to judge Rachel, and certainly not to judge the man she loved. This is a story about choices, the ones we make, the ones we don't make, and the consequences of both. But more than anything, this is a story about what happens when we forget ourselves in the process of building a life for someone else, and what we discover when that life comes crashing down. So sit with me for a moment. Let me tell you about Rachel and the house she built with her own two hands, her own time, and her own heart. Rachel was 34 years old when her world changed, but the truth is, her world had been slowly changing for much longer than that. It had been shifting piece by piece, brick by brick, for over a decade. She met her husband, Michael, when they were both young and hopeful. She was 24, he was 31. At the time, the age difference felt sophisticated to her. He was established, he had his own apartment, he seemed to know who he was in the world. She was still figuring things out, still in that phase of life where you believe that if you love someone enough, if you show up enough, you can build something unshakable together. They were together for 3 years before they married. Those early years were good, by most accounts. They would go out on weekends. They would talk late into the night about their dreams. She would tell him about the books she was reading, the career she wanted to build. And he would listen, or at least it seemed like he was listening. But then, about 8 years before our story truly begins, something shifted. Michael started having anxiety, severe anxiety, and with it came insomnia. Night after night, he would lie awake, unable to sleep, his mind racing with worries about things that hadn't happened yet and probably never would. And Rachel did what a lot of people do when they love someone who is suffering. She tried to fix it. She would stay up with him. She would hold his hand. She would do breathing exercises with him, talking him through the techniques she found online, in self-help books, in articles about anxiety management. She would do this night after night, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning, and then she would wake up at 6, get ready for work, and go to her job exhausted. She was working full-time at that point. She had her own career. She was building something for herself, but increasingly, her energy was being poured into managing his anxiety instead. Now, I want to pause here and say something important. There's nothing wrong with supporting a partner through a mental health crisis. Love means showing up for people when they're struggling. That's real. That's beautiful even. But there's a point, and sometimes we don't see it until much later, where supporting someone transforms into sacrificing yourself, where you become so focused on their healing that you stop paying attention to your own well-being. Rachel didn't see that point when she was in it. She just saw her husband suffering, and she responded with compassion. But she also started to get tired. Over time, Rachel began to encourage Michael to seek professional help. She found him a therapist. She pushed him to take it seriously. And to his credit, he did. The anxiety slowly improved. He started sleeping better. He started feeling more like himself. And Rachel felt relieved. Relieved that the crisis had passed. Relieved that things were going to get better. Relieved that she could finally have her life back. Except she didn't. Because by then, a pattern had been established. A pattern where Rachel's role was to be the caretaker, the supporter, the one who sacrificed. And Michael had gotten used to that. More than that, he had begun to expect it. 6 years before everything fell apart, Michael's mother became very ill. She had cancer, and it was serious. Michael was devastated. He loved his mother deeply, and the thought of losing her was unbearable for him. Rachel saw her husband in pain, and she made a decision that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She quit her job. Now, this wasn't a decision made lightly. Rachel and Michael had sat down and looked at the numbers. Rachel was making less money than Michael, and Michael had the potential to earn significantly more in his career. It made financial sense, they told themselves. It made practical sense. What it also meant was that Rachel was giving up her independence. She was giving up her career momentum. She was giving up the part of her identity that existed outside of the home, outside of being someone's wife or someone's caretaker. But in that moment, what mattered most to Rachel was being there for her family, for Michael, for his mother. She believed, and I think this is important, she believed that this was temporary, that once his mother recovered, or once the crisis passed, she would go back to work. She would reclaim her life. She was wrong about that. While Rachel was at home, caring for her dying mother-in-law, she got pregnant. It wasn't planned exactly, but it also wasn't prevented. And when Rachel told Michael, his suggestion was almost gentle in its inevitability. "Why don't you stay home?" he said. "Take care of the baby. By the time you're ready to go back to work, the kids will be older, and it'll be easier." And Rachel, already depleted from caring for her mother-in-law, already out of the workforce, already in a caregiving mindset, agreed. So she did what millions of women do. She became a stay-at-home mother. And this is where I want to be very careful, because I don't want anyone listening to think that I'm judging this choice. Being a stay-at-home parent is real work. It's valuable work. It's exhausting work. I'm not saying it's a bad choice, but I am saying that when you make this choice, you need to do it with eyes wide open. You need to understand what you're choosing, and you need to make sure it's a choice you're making for yourself, not a choice you're making because it's the easiest path or because it's what someone else wants. Rachel made this choice when she was already vulnerable, when she was already tired, when she had already given up so much. And what she found in the years that followed was that the longer she stayed home, the more her husband seemed to treat her as though she was simply part of the infrastructure of their life, like she was the house that held everything together, but not quite a person in her own right. She gave birth to their daughter in March, and immediately afterward, she fell into postpartum depression. She felt fat and ugly and invisible. She felt trapped in her own home with a newborn and no one to talk to except the baby. And where was Michael? Working, always busy, always too tired to really connect with her. When Rachel would try to talk to him about how she was feeling, he would say, "I wouldn't understand. Work is too stressful. I'm too tired." So Rachel stopped trying. She called her mother. Her mother would stay on video calls with her while Rachel fed the baby, while she changed diapers, while she sat in the dark at 3 a.m, wondering if this was all life was going to be from now on. It was her mother's voice that kept Rachel from completely disappearing into the fog of postpartum depression. And it was during this time that Rachel began to suggest couples therapy. Michael kept saying everything was fine. "There's something I want to talk about, and I think it's important that we sit with this for a moment." Rachel used to be a different person. Not fundamentally different. Her core was always the same, but her life was different. Her identity was different. She used to read voraciously. She would go to bookstores and spend hours getting lost in the philosophy section, the history section, the fiction section. She would come home with stacks of books and spend her evenings reading and taking notes and thinking. She used to study. She took online courses. She was interested in ideas, big ideas about politics, about how society worked, about what made people tick. She was interesting, not in the way that means she had accomplishments or credentials, but in the way that means she was engaged with the world. She had thoughts. She had opinions. She could talk for hours about books or art or current events, and she was not insecure about any of this. She didn't feel like she wasn't enough. She felt like she had something to offer to the world and to the people in her life. But slowly, over the years of staying home, of being the primary caregiver, of pouring all of her energy into her family, that part of her began to fade. She didn't have time to read anymore. Between the baby and the older daughter, and keeping the house running and trying to be present for her husband, there was no time. She didn't take courses. She didn't have the mental space or the bandwidth. She didn't have conversations about big ideas. The conversations she had were about what the baby ate, whether the toddler had enough sleep, what was for dinner. And so gradually Rachel began to disappear. But here's the thing. Here's what I think is really important to understand about Rachel's story. At the exact moment when she was losing herself, when she was most vulnerable, when she needed her partner to see her and acknowledge her sacrifice and value her, Michael was pulling away. He was working longer hours, he was always tired, he was emotionally unavailable, and Rachel, who had sacrificed so much already, interpreted this as failure on her part. If she were a better wife, maybe he wouldn't be so distant. If she were more attractive, but she'd gained weight, hadn't she? Pregnancy did that. Maybe he would want to be around her. So she internalized his distance as her fault. This is what I call the trap. And so many women fall into it. You give and you give and you give, and when the other person pulls away, you blame yourself for not giving enough, for not being enough. But there was something else Rachel did during this time, something that would become incredibly important later. She decorated. With her own money Michael didn't know the full extent of because it came from odd jobs and small gigs she could do from home, Rachel slowly transformed their house into something beautiful, something that reflected her taste, her vision, her dreams. She chose colors that made her feel alive. She picked out furniture that spoke to her. She designed a kitchen that she loved. She created a garden from scratch. She planted vegetables that she could grow and nurture. She hung a chair where she could sit with her baby and feel for a moment like she was somewhere beautiful. In many ways, that house became the only thing she was creating anymore. It became an outlet for her creativity, for her artistic vision, for the part of her that was still seeking expression in a life that had become increasingly narrow. The house was hers in a way that nothing else was hers anymore. And I think when we get to the moment where everything changes, I want you to remember this. Remember that the house wasn't just about aesthetics or property value. For Rachel, that house was a physical representation of who she still was, of the dreams she still had, of the part of herself that she had managed to preserve. It was December when Michael got the promotion. More hours, more money, more status. Rachel was excited for him. This was what he'd wanted. This was the opportunity he'd been working toward. She was also nervous because she knew what more hours meant. It meant less time at home. It meant being even more alone. But she didn't say anything. By this point, she'd learned not to say things that might burden Michael or make him feel like she wasn't supporting him. So she said, "Congratulations. I'm so proud of you." And she meant it. She did, even though it meant she would be even more alone. In March, their second daughter was born, a newborn, a 4-month-old baby, and Rachel found herself back in the postpartum haze, back to the nights and the exhaustion and the feeling of being invisible. Michael was busy with his new promotion. He was tired, he was distant. Rachel suggested couples therapy again. She was becoming desperate for some kind of help, some kind of indication that they could work through whatever was happening between them. "Everything's fine," Michael said again. "We're fine." But they weren't fine. Rachel could feel it. Something had shifted. Something had broken or was breaking, and no one was paying attention except her. Then, one evening in early December, about 9 months after his promotion, Michael came home later than usual. Rachel was happy to see him. She was in the living room with their older daughter, and when Michael came in, she smiled at him. She was genuinely glad he was home. He asked his older daughter to go to her room, and then he sat down, and Rachel could smell alcohol on his breath. "I love you so much," he said, "but I don't want to be with you anymore." Rachel's mind went blank for a moment. She couldn't process what he was saying. The words didn't make sense. People didn't say things like that. Not out of the blue. Not after 10 years together. Not after everything they'd built. "What are you talking about?" she asked him. And then he told her. He told her that she wasn't the person he fell in love with anymore. He told her that he had been having feelings for someone at work. A girl, really, he said, barely 22 years old, and he was in love with her. He wanted to explore that love without guilt. He wanted to give himself the chance to live authentically, without guilt, as if Rachel's pain, her sacrifice, her entire life was something he could just step over on his way to his own happiness. Rachel sat there, holding their baby, trying to process what was happening, and the first thing that came out of her mouth was, "But what about my home decor?" I know that sounds absurd. I know that when you read that, you probably think, why is she worried about decorations when her marriage is falling apart? But here's what I think happened in that moment. Rachel's mind couldn't process the emotional devastation. Not yet. It was too big, too overwhelming. So it latched onto something concrete, something she could understand and fight for, something that was hers, because the house was the only thing she had left. It was the only thing in her entire life that was completely, entirely hers. She had given Michael everything else. Her time, her career, her youth, her energy, her future. But the house was hers.
And in that moment of absolute shock and devastation, her mind went to the one thing she was terrified of losing.
The argument that followed was ugly. Rachel found herself shouting about the house, about how she had put time into it, about how she had made it beautiful, about how it was everything she'd ever dreamed of. Michael responded by saying that she didn't value his suffering enough, that she was being selfish, that she was making this about material things instead of about their relationship. But Rachel understood something in that moment, something important. She understood that she was disposable to Michael, that all of her sacrifices, all of her years of showing up and caregiving and putting his needs before her own meant nothing. In his mind, he had been suffering. His anxiety, his stress, his career pressures, that was what mattered. What Rachel had given up, what she had sacrificed, what she had lost of herself, that was irrelevant. She was 34 years old. She had a 4-month-old baby and a 4-year-old daughter. She had no job. She had no income. She had no recent work experience. She was terrified. And the only thing she could think to fight for was the house. Michael wanted an amicable divorce. He wanted to make proposals that benefited him. He wanted Rachel to be reasonable and understanding. But Rachel had finally decided not to be reasonable, not anymore. She called her brother-in-law, Michael's brother, actually, who had been through his own infidelity situation the year before. He understood. He came to the house immediately and asked Michael to leave. Michael listened to his brother in a way he clearly wasn't listening to his wife. Rachel's mother was called. She got a visa and came to stay with Rachel and the girls. Rachel's father, who lived in another country, made plans to visit. Rachel hired a lawyer, a good lawyer, a lawyer who was angry on her behalf because Rachel was too depleted to feel anger yet. And when Michael tried to sneak a proposal past her, showing up at 11 at night with a document suggesting he keep the house and give her money instead, Rachel didn't engage. She didn't negotiate. She asked him to leave. When he got angry, when he yelled, when he called her names, when he tried to convince her that the house was his and that his new girlfriend, Anne, had suggested Rachel would try to take it, Rachel didn't waver. She was done giving. She was done sacrificing. She was done being the good woman, the understanding wife, the reasonable one. She was going to fight. Now, I want to address something that some people might not understand about Rachel's reaction. Some people, when they read about this story, wondered why Rachel was so focused on the house, why she didn't seem to fight for the marriage, why she didn't express more sadness about Michael himself. And I think this question reveals something really important about how we perceive women's pain. The truth is, Rachel would miss Michael terribly. She wrote about it later, how much it hurt, how much she loved him, how much she had given of herself to build a life with him. She described the pain as almost unbearable. But in that first moment, in that immediate aftermath, her mind went to the house because her mind understood what she was about to lose. Rachel had already lost Michael. She had been losing him for years, slowly, as he pulled away and emotionally abandoned her. She had already grieved that loss, even if she hadn't consciously acknowledged it. But the house was the last thing she had created, the last thing that was hers, the last physical representation of her value and her effort and her dreams. And when Michael tried to take that too, when he tried to rewrite the narrative and claim that the house was his, even though she had decorated it and designed it and created it with her own money and her own vision, Rachel finally said, "No, not this. You can have everything else. You can take my time, my youth, my career, my identity, but you cannot take this." I think there's something profoundly important about that moment, because it's the moment when Rachel stopped disappearing. It's the moment when she stopped sacrificing herself. It's the moment when she finally said, "I deserve something. I deserve at least this." And the tragedy of it, the real tragedy, is that it took her losing her marriage to remember that she deserved anything at all. Because that's what happens when you slowly give everything to someone. You forget that you're worth something. You forget that your dreams matter. You forget that you deserve to be seen and valued and loved for who you are, not just for what you can do for someone else. Rachel's story is not unique. There are millions of women living versions of this story. Women who have given up their careers to support their partners. Women who have become invisible in their own homes. Women who have sacrificed so much that they don't even recognize themselves anymore. And what Michael did, what so many men do, was take that sacrifice for granted. He took Rachel's constant, endless, exhausting support, and he decided it wasn't enough. He decided he wanted something else, someone younger, someone who didn't remind him of his obligations or his guilt. But here's what I think Michael didn't understand. And here's what I hope you understand. If you're listening to this story and you see yourself in Rachel, the woman Michael fell in love with, the interesting, vibrant woman who read books and had opinions about art and could talk about ideas, that woman didn't disappear because of anything wrong with her. She disappeared because Michael let her. He watched her sacrifice her career. He accepted it. He benefited from it. He let her fade into the background of their life, and he never once asked her to come back. He never once said, "Wait, I miss who you were. I want to help you get back to that." Instead, he just let her disappear, and then he blamed her for not being the same person anymore. That's not love. That's not partnership. That's extraction. And Rachel deserves better. Rachel deserves a partner who sees her, who values her, who doesn't ask her to sacrifice herself and then blame her for the sacrifice. I hope Rachel fights for that house. I hope she gets it. I hope she keeps that beautiful space that she created, that garden she planted, that chair where she sat with her baby and remembered who she was. I hope she uses it as a foundation, a place to rebuild, a place to remember that she's worthy of more than just being someone's support system. Because that house isn't just a house, it's a monument to the part of Rachel that survived. The part that kept creating, kept dreaming, kept fighting to maintain some part of herself, even when everything around her was asking her to disappear. And that part of her, that part deserves to be honored. So that's Rachel's story. And I know it's not a happy ending. Not yet, anyway. We don't know how the divorce will turn out. We don't know if she'll get the house. We don't know what happens to her in the years that follow. But what I know is this: Rachel made a choice. She decided not to disappear quietly. She decided to fight. She decided that she was worth fighting for. And that's where all stories of resilience begin. Thank you for sitting with me and Rachel through this story. I hope you found something in it that mattered to you. And I hope that if you see yourself in Rachel's journey, you remember this moment. Remember that you are worthy of being seen. You are worthy of having dreams of your own. You are worthy of not disappearing.
Take care of yourselves.